The moment my daughter's much-praised husband tore off his mask of false courtesy and hurled the scalding coffee across my face, searing not just my skin, but my very soul, I knew I had no choice left. That instant revealed the arrogance and cruelty hidden behind his polished manners, and it marked the beginning of the merciless lesson I was destined to give my daughter, a lesson harsher than anything life itself could teach. At my daughter's much-celebrated wedding, while everyone praised her angel-faced husband Edward, speaking of what a perfect partner he would be, a tiny seed of doubt had already begun to take root within me. Behind that flawless smile, I sensed a coldness, a distance I could not name, and I prayed it was nothing more than a mother's needless worry. From the very first days of their marriage, there were those dismissive remarks slipped into conversations, those arrogant gestures that belittled my opinions, and those fleeting, mocking glances that only I seemed to notice. They were like small but disturbing shadows cast upon the perfect image my daughter so blindly cherished. The hidden disrespect became undeniable the day he threw away with theatrical disdain the salad I had lovingly prepared, as though it were poison, in front of my daughter. And when she chose to stand at her husband's side instead of mine in the face of that humiliation, it pierced my heart with the first true dagger. From that night onwards, I knew that my silence and patience would never put an end to his contempt, nor would it open my daughter's eyes to the truth. I realized that not only for my own dignity, but to protect my child from the poisonous ivy she had taken into her life, I had no choice but to reveal the true face of that devil in disguise. To strike at the very core of his greedy, self-serving soul, I decided to use the small but fertile orchard left to me by my late father as bait. I knew this plan was dangerous, both to expose his true character and to awaken my daughter, but I also knew, with bitter certainty, that there was no other way. The moment I mentioned that little orchard, I caught a predatory gleam flash in Edward's eyes before he hastily hid it behind a mask of false kindness and concern. In that instant, I saw how eager he was to bite, and with fear and unshakable resolve, I set the cruel wheels of my plan in motion. When he came alone to my home, cloaking himself behind endless legal jargon, pressing me to sign papers without hesitation, I began to see the edges of his mask fraying. His impatience, his ruthless face breaking through his charming exterior, revealed not only his greed, but the depth of his danger. A manipulative liar of the worst kind. And then came the terrible moment when the last remnant of feigned respect crumbled. With monstrous fury, he hurled scalding coffee at my face. The burning heat seared not just my skin, but consumed, once and for all, any trace of mercy or patience I had left for him. As I looked in the mirror, watching the dark streaks of coffee run down my face, I no longer saw a timid, victimized mother. I saw a woman sharpened by fire, her soul ablaze with the determination to protect her child and to teach that cruel man the lesson he so richly deserved, even if it meant knocking at the very gates of hell to do so. I realized in that very moment that the coffee stains left behind by that monster and the cruel burn mark upon my face must cease to be the symbol of my victimhood and instead become the undeniable proof of his depravity and brutality. They would serve as my strongest weapons before the tribunal of justice, tearing away his false angel's mask once and for all. When I bit my tongue to stop myself from screaming the truth to my own daughter, the scar on my face was her husband's doing. I learned that sometimes a mother, in order to shield her child from an even greater heartbreak, can tell the most painful lies without hesitation, ignoring the fact that her own heart is bleeding in silence, standing before that honorable, elderly solicitor with whom I had never before shared a single sorrow or secret, and confessing such a shameful story was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But I knew then that I could not walk this battlefield alone. The sword of justice had to be placed in the hands of someone experienced, reliable, and wise enough to wield it. As I turned my own home into a snare, waiting to catch his next attack or immoral confession, I felt how these walls, once filled with laughter and peace, had now become silent witnesses, my most faithful allies, holding their breath until the great day when justice would finally be served. When I sent him that message, pretending I had surrendered and fallen into his trap, he never realized that I was in fact luring him into his own. For he thought he was dealing only with a frail old woman, yet standing before him now was a patient viper, waiting for the fatal mistake that would seal his fate. The very next day, when he appeared at my door with that smug, self-assured smile, as though he hadn't hurled boiling coffee at me hours before, I saw how pride and greed can blind a man. He chose to believe the tears I shed yesterday meant nothing, and that today I would gladly trade them for the papers he was pushing in front of me. That blindness strengthened my resolve when I reminded him, ever so lightly, of the vile crime he had committed. Instead of remorse, I was met with his mocking laughter and threats. In that moment, I knew that the small device hidden in the room, recording every word, was not my witness, but his. His own cruelty and dishonor were condemning him as he dared to dream of his future luxuries, funded by my money, while looking me in the eye and treating my father's last legacy as nothing but a commodity. I realized he was not merely buying an orchard. He was placing a price on my life, my memories, my dignity. That thought extinguished the very last spark of pity I had for him. And when I spoke my daughter's name, only to see this so-called angelic son-in-law transform into a tyrant, someone who regarded her as his possession, dismissed her worth, and openly threatened me, I knew this was no longer about an inheritance. It had become a struggle to free my child from the grasp of a monster. By allowing him to believe he had won a small victory with my forged signatures, I secured the greatest victory of all. For hidden within that little device were his threats, his cruelty, his confessions. And I knew then, with unshakable certainty, that justice often speaks not in grand speeches, but through the quiet testimony of the most unexpected witnesses. Even that elderly solicitor, a man seasoned by decades of witnessing lies and corruption, could not disguise the grim tightening of his jaw when he heard my son-in-law's venomous words and the way he threatened me. In that instant, I knew the small recorder in my hand was not just evidence, but the undeniable proof that evil, in its most arrogant moment, always unmasks itself. My solicitor offered me legal avenues, prison sentences, and financial penalties that could have bound his body for a time. But I knew they would never pierce the blind love in my daughter's heart, nor erase the false hero image she had built of her husband. My true aim was not to see him caged behind iron bars, but to strip his soul bare before her eyes with his own words and his own depravity. I discovered then that a small legal clause quietly drawn up by my late husband before his death had unknowingly become my guardian angel years later. To learn that the document Keenan had forced me to sign in his greed was utterly worthless proved to me how fate sometimes hides a shield at the side of the honest, waiting to be revealed at the right moment. No longer was I merely a wounded mother. I had become a strategist, holding in my hand the sharpest blade of justice, fully aware of when, where, and how to strike. In that moment, I realized how far a woman, in the defense of her child and her honor, can weave the most intricate of plans and bring even the cruelest of enemies to their knees. When I arranged that final meeting for my daughter in a voice as calm as if it were a routine appointment, I knew I was not simply inviting her to a solicitor's office. I was summoning her to a courtroom, one where she would face the bitter truth about the man she called her husband. I knew, too, that the final signature that day would not merely close a property deal, but also shatter her illusion of happiness. As we sat among the bureaucratic clutter and the hum of strangers, waiting for the storm that was about to break, I performed the greatest role of my life. Outwardly, I appeared to be just another quiet old woman. Inside me, however, ticked the cold and silent countdown of a primed bomb. And then, at the precise moment we had planned, my solicitor entered, like a crusader of justice from an old film scene, and with his firm, confident voice challenged the sale. I watched with relish as the look of triumph on my son-in-law's face dissolved, replaced by the anxious shock of a hunter realizing his prey was slipping away. The sharp click of the small recorder being placed on the table was like the first tremor of an earthquake, shaking the foundations of his grand palace of lies. I knew the poisonous words soon to emerge from that device would not merely expose him. They would sweep away my daughter's fantasy in a devastating tidal wave. When my daughter heard her own husband's monstrous voice, his unmistakable threats, his vile hatred towards me, I saw my daughter's innocent face shatter like porcelain falling into 1,000 sharp pieces. In that instant, she lost not only her husband, but every belief she had ever clung to him about him. And when my daughter, her hands trembling, pulled off the wedding ring she had once seen as the symbol of eternal love and hurled it onto the pile of his lies like a monument of shame, I knew my long war was finally over. For in that moment I realized I had saved far more than a small orchard. I had rescued my most precious flower, my beloved child, from the strangling grip of a poisonous vine. In that moment, when I was no longer a hunter nor a strategist, but simply a mother trying to shield her wounded bird, my only daughter, from the cruel hunter who had struck her down, I realized it was the most sacred and meaningful instant of my struggle, for I understood then that justice was not only about punishing the guilty, but also about lifting the innocent soul from beneath the rubble of betrayal. I knew his pitiful pleas and desperate excuses would find no echo in my daughter's heart, now torn open by betrayal and disappointment. For when a fortress of trust has been built upon lies, the first hard blow of truth reduces it to dust, and there remains neither faith nor desire to rebuild it. As I watched my child, crushed beneath the ruins of her rosy dreams, blame her own innocence and purity, I chose not to tell her that even the sharpest eyes can be blinded by love, and even the wisest hearts can be bewitched by lies. Instead, I simply held her close in silence, allowing time and a mother's embrace to heal those wounds that words could never touch. When I saw his name flashing on her phone, once the name that made her heart race, now nothing but a stranger, stirring shame and bitterness, I knew it was the most painful yet necessary step. For the only way to rid oneself of poison is not to search for an antidote, but to purge it entirely from one's life. As I looked upon my daughter's innocent face in sleep, I knew that though I had forced her to confront a bitter truth she would never forget, I had also spared her from countless lies and deeper wounds yet to come. Sometimes a mother must choose not her child's fleeting happiness, but her lasting peace, even if it means taking the hardest and most merciless decisions. Watching her, in the aftermath of devastation, retreat into the world of colors as a child might, seeking refuge from pain through paint and brushes, I realized that the deepest wounds of the soul are not always healed by reason, but by returning to the most simple and innocent passions we had long forgotten. To see that man who once carried himself with arrogant posture and words sharp enough to cut, now waiting outside my door like a discarded dog, desperate to be let in, showed me that his power had never been real. It had been born only of the faith and value we gave him, and once stripped away, he was revealed as nothing more than a hollow shell. His belief that he could erase his sins and the sting of scalding coffee with a handful of gaudy flowers and hollow words of remorse proved not only his cruelty, but also how ignorant he was of the human soul. For there are stains no bouquet in the world can cleanse. When I finally confessed to my daughter that all this had never been about a property sale, but was in truth a carefully laid game to save her life, I saw in her eyes the glow of gratitude and the deep respect that comes with understanding how far a mother will go for her child. In that look, I found the richest reward for all the pain and tears I had endured, and in the moment she left behind that house, once a castle of her dreams, now a prison of lies, taking with her only a few cherished memories, I knew she had not merely walked out of a building, she had walked away from a poisoned past, from a false life, and from a cruel man. That was her true moment of freedom. The moment my daughter awoke from that false princess fairy tale and resolved to rebuild her life, not on another's generosity, but on her own hard work and long-forgotten talents, I saw her transform from a victim into a strong woman who had seized control of her own destiny. When she chose not to bury the pain of betrayal within herself, but instead to turn it into a fight for justice, to ensure that no other innocent soul would be scarred by that cruel heart, I realized she was not only healing her own wounds, but also embracing a deeper social responsibility. The thought of him, for the very first time, tasting the same fear and helplessness he had inflicted on others, when his name appeared coldly inscribed on official papers, was for me not a thrill of vengeance, but proof of divine justice, that even the proudest spirits must one day face the harvest of the seeds they have sown. To witness the intellect and talents she had forgotten in the shadow of her husband rekindle like embers beneath the ashes reminded me that a woman's true power lies not in borrowed titles or luxury, but in her own mind and the skill in her hands, gifts that no one can take away. The day I heard her say that uncertainty, once her greatest fear, now felt like a door to countless new beginnings, I understood that she had broken free not only from her husband, but also from the rusty chains of false security and comfortable captivity. Watching his glittering career, built upon lies and a carefully crafted image, collapse like a house of cards at the first tremor of truth, taught me that a person's reputation in society is upheld not by expensive cars or tailored suits, but by the integrity of the character they show when no one is watching. When I saw my daughter experiencing a joy far more genuine than any she had felt while boasting of her husband's limitless credit cards, the joy of earning her first modest wage through her own efforts, I understood again that the strongest bond to life is not another's favor, but the dignity of bread won by one's own sweat. And as for him, the man who had once surrounded himself with shallow friends and crowds bought with wealth and status, watching him face the truth of his own loneliness when that wealth and status began to crumble was a bitter lesson that fate often teaches its hardest truths through the mirror of one's own emptiness. When my daughter laid aside those meaningless, costly dresses and instead put on the simple work clothes that made her feel valuable and productive again, I knew she was not merely beginning a job. She was reclaiming her identity, her independence, and her long-buried dreams. That moment was my greatest joy. That small patch of land left to us by my father became for us far more than its material worth. It stood as a fortress of memory, a reminder of our family's unshakable honesty and strong roots. In life's darkest hours, I realized that a person draws their greatest strength not from riches, but from the past and the pure memories that still live within it. The man who once looked at me with eyes full of arrogance and power, who once threatened me, now stood crushed beneath the ruins of his false world, weeping on my doorstep and seeking mercy from the very face he had once scalded with coffee. In that moment, I realized that justice is not always delivered in the noisy chambers of a court, but often in the quiet, shadowed corridors of a man's own conscience. To see that my daughter still carried somewhere in her heart the bittersweet poison of those happier days they once shared, that this poison could stir a fleeting pity even for such a monster, taught me that the most dangerous prison is not one of iron bars, but the prison of memory, filled with those aching whispers of if only things had been different. When I chose not to strike him, not to curse him, but simply to leave him alone with the consequences of his own actions, I understood that the greatest punishment one can inflict is not rage, but abandonment. To leave someone utterly alone with the suffocating silence of their own wickedness. When my daughter spent her first earnings not on a handbag or some glittering trinket, but on a book to nourish her mind and a small flower to nurture her hopes, I knew she had finally freed herself, not only from material excess, but from that poisoned world of vanity. She had learned to measure her worth in the right things. In the end, after all the storms and merciless battles, I discovered that the greatest fortress in life is not a mansion with thick walls or a gated estate. The truest and strongest fortress is a pair of loyal hands offering you a cup of tea and sitting quietly by your side when you need it most. To see him walking once again through those court corridors where he had always strutted so proudly, but this time branded not with honor, but with shame, taught me that the greatest court is not the wooden benches and heavy law books, but the silent, unforgiving eyes of society that watch and judge without end. That day, sitting in the cold courtroom, as his own recorded voice echoed with the venom of his crimes, I realized once more that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way out, and that no lie repeated 1,000 times can ever withstand the whisper of truth when it finally rises. To witness the same man who once tried to control my home, my life, and my relationship with my daughter, now utterly cut off from us by the impenetrable wall of the law, was not for me a victory of vengeance, but an affirmation that justice had finally sanctified the inviolable boundaries of our lives. The day we chose to cast aside the shameful cloak of victimhood and wear the armor of justice instead, I saw how the eyes around us changed from pity to respect. It taught me that society values not those who quietly endure injustice, but those who rise against it with courage. And years later, to return to the land over which such storms once raged, not with fear or bitterness, but with the quiet peace of knowing that our roots, deep and honest as the soil itself, had carried us through the battle. That was the sweetest fruit of this long, weary journey. to see the elderly parents who had once proudly raised their angel-faced son now bowing under the shame of his disgraceful crimes and asking my forgiveness showed me in the most painful way that the harm a person does is never theirs alone. It wounds the honor of everyone who loved, believed in, and sacrificed for them. Watching my daughter recover the laughter, the lightness, and the warmth of friendly conversation she had lost within the walls of that toxic marriage, this time in the safe harbor of friends who truly cared for her, proved to me that freedom is not merely escaping an oppressor, but reclaiming the life and identity that person tried to steal. The final decree read out in the courtroom was not just a legal document ending a marriage. It was a dignified testament validating months of pain, tears, and struggle. And it lifted from my daughter's shoulders not only the weight of a broken marriage, but also the crushing shame of having endured injustice. The young woman who once measured success in the glitter of her husband's gifts now stood applauded for a project she had stayed up nights perfecting with her own intelligence and perseverance. In that moment, she discovered that life's most valuable investment lies not in cars or jewels, but in the unique wealth of one's own mind and potential. And when the darkest storms had passed, and we had clung to each other like lifelines through every wave, I knew our bond as mother and daughter had become something greater. It was no longer simply blood, but the unbreakable tie of comrades who had fought side by side in life's hardest battles. To see my daughter reclaim her taste, her individuality in a modest yet warm home she had decorated with her own hands and spirit reminded me that a person's true palace is not made of gilded walls, but of the four walls within which they feel free and at peace. Though that cruel man had gone from our lives, the shadow he left lingered in my daughter's heart, resurfacing at unexpected moments, sometimes at the simple sound of a doorbell. It showed me that the deepest cruelty is not the pain inflicted in the moment, but the poisonous traces that linger long after. When she could finally look at a coffee cup, the very object tied to her trauma, not as a threat, but once again as a simple symbol of friendship and kindness, I knew she was beginning not only to overcome the memory, but also to defeat the fear and prejudice that memory had imprinted on her soul. Hearing of the downfall and disgrace now endured by the man who once caused me such pain, I felt no triumph. That absence of gloating told me my spirit was at last free from the toxic cycle of revenge. True justice, I realized, is not delighting in another's suffering, but knowing that everyone, in the end, must face the consequences of their own deeds. And finally, when the storms had all passed and each of us had returned to our own safe harbors, I understood that what truly binds a mother and daughter is not simply sharing the same roof, but sharing the unseen labor of healing one another's wounds, and knowing, no matter the distance, that when we look up at the same sky, we can feel the silent strength of each other in our hearts. I knew that what my daughter lost in that toxic marriage was not only her trust in her husband, but also her innocent faith in people themselves. That is why seeing her, even if she could not fully lower the wounded walls around her soul, at least lean over them with hope and curiosity in response to a stranger's honest, uncalculated smile, was for me the greatest joy. After years of putting her happiness above my own, tossed like a ship in the storms of her life, I finally felt, as she found safe harbor at last, that it was time to raise my own sails and set course for the calm and peaceful waters of my own spirit. The moment we realized that the man who had once dominated our lives, dictating every decision, every fear, every tear, was now reduced to nothing more than a faded, meaningless memory, we saw how time itself can heal even the deepest wounds, and how even the fiercest storms eventually leave behind only a clear sky. When my daughter used her first earnings to take us far from the painful shadows of the past to the sea air and its cleansing scent of salt, I knew she was not only giving me a holiday, but granting her own spirit a release. We were no longer filling our days with sorrow, but with the excitement of new places to discover and new memories to create. And when I saw that from the wreckage we had clung through together, we had emerged not as victims, but as two strong women, standing at the water's edge beneath the moonlight, looking to the future with hope, I understood that no matter how deep one sinks, with even a single person who believes in you by your side, you can always rise to the surface again, and that the darkest night is always pregnant with the brightest dawn. To witness these very grounds, once stained with betrayal and anguish, now reborn with my grandchild's innocent laughter and the saplings of hope we had planted for the future, showed me that life has the miraculous power to make flowers bloom even over poisoned soil, so long as there is time and love. When my daughter discovered, after the collapse of her glittering but false fairy tale, that happiness does not lie in noisy, dazzling passions, but in the quiet, steady voice that says, "I am here," when all else fails, I knew she had found not just a partner, but a true companion. The day I read a letter from the mother of the man who once caused us such pain, containing no reproach, no accusation, only the humble recognition that my hard step had in truth rescued her son as well from a swamp he could not escape, I understood that sometimes the harshest medicine heals not only the patient, but everyone around them. To see my daughter turn the darkest and most shameful memory of her life into a torch to light another's darkness showed me that even the deepest suffering, if carried wisely, can transform a soul, making it gentler, more compassionate, and strong enough to understand and tend the wounds of others. And at last, when I looked around the table at 3 generations sharing a meal together in peace and love on this land once cursed by betrayal, I knew that the story which had begun with a cup of scalding coffee hurled in my face had now ended in reconciliation. Life had taught me that no matter how cruel its beginning, with patience, courage, and an unshakable belief in justice, it can always write the most beautiful of endings. When I saw my grandchild hold in her tiny palm a simple olive that for us had once been the symbol of an entire war, and gaze at it with nothing more than the pure curiosity of a child discovering a new toy, I realized that it was we ourselves who burden objects and places with poisonous meanings. Life, through the innocence of new generations, holds the power to turn even the darkest memories into the cleanest of new pages. After my former son-in-law, who thought that blood alone entitled him to the word family, though he never lived its spirit, now hearing this kind-hearted man with no obligation call me Mum out of nothing but respect and love, I felt deep in my bones that family is not a title bestowed at birth, but an honor earned through devotion and care. As I closed for the last time the bitter book in which I had tallied the storms of my most turbulent years, I knew I was not just shutting a story, but locking away the heavy weight of the past, the thirst for revenge, and those sorrowful days. I understood that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is not to carry our past like a wound that never heals, but to transform it into a memory, respected, remembered, but no longer poisoning the present. The helplessness and panic I once felt during my daughter's collapse seemed so unnecessary now as I tended to a small scratch on my grandchild's hand. For life inevitably will wound us all, whether lightly or deeply. The true test is not in avoiding the fall, but in finding within yourself each time you stumble the strength to rise again, wiser and braver than before. And in the end, after untying life's most tangled knots, climbing its steepest hills, and surviving its deepest ravines, I learned that the finest view is not found atop a high mountain, nor in the glitter of a wealthy city. The most beautiful, most peaceful view lies in the simple moment of breathing, surrounded by those you love, held in quiet gratitude. When I recall my old life, where happiness seemed to be hidden inside expensive packages from luxury shops, and compare it to watching my grandchild dream of an entire ocean in a walnut shell, I finally understand. True wealth is not about how much you own, but how much joy you can draw from what little you hold. Hearing that my daughter saw the money she earned not as a means to buy new luxuries, but as a tool to give her mother the safety she had long deserved, I realized that money in the hands of a good heart becomes an instrument of mercy and loyalty, while in the hands of the cruel, it turns into a weapon of pride and oppression. The truth lies not in money itself, but in the conscience that governs it. When I finally left behind that old self who measured every kindness, who secretly expected a return for every gift, I understood that the purest charity is the one your left hand gives while your right hand remains unaware, an act unseen, uncrazed, carried only as a silent secret between your conscience and God. After years of loud, selfish family dinners where everyone spoke their own monologues and no one listened, to now sit at this small but warm table where each person genuinely shares in another's day, I discovered that what makes a family home is not a grand house or a crowded feast, but the peaceful silence that flows between hearts that truly understand one another. And at last, when I looked upon the land for which I had once fought so many battles, I saw no deeds or titles. What I saw instead were trees whispering to me that the deeper the roots, the stronger one stands against storms, that even the most barren soil can, with patience, bear the sweetest fruit, and that, in the end, every living soul must return in peace to the soil it truly belongs to. After those dark days, when I used to wake each morning with the heavy dread of wondering what new lie, what fresh insult, or what bitter disappointment awaited me, I now rise to a new dawn with nothing but the sound of birdsong and the soothing scent of linden tea. To begin a day free from fear or expectation is, I feel in every fiber of my being, the most priceless wealth a person can ever possess. As I whisper to my grandchild the same simple yet magical lullabies once passed down to me by my own mother, songs I had forgotten amidst the endless rush and ambition of raising my own children, I know that I am not only lulling him to sleep, but also repairing the most fragile and pure thread of our family's bond. When I can look at photographs of my darkest, most painful days, no longer with rage or sorrow, but with a kind of gratitude, seeing them as the stepping stones that shaped me into the wiser, calmer woman I am today, I understand that true happiness is not simply in collecting lovely memories, but in turning even the worst memories into lessons worth carrying. In my youth, I once looked upon every withered flower and fallen leaf as an omen of my own inevitable end. But now, with the quiet wisdom of age, I see that every death gives life back to the soil, and I bear witness, without fear, without protest, to life's oldest and most unshakable truth, that every beginning has an end, and every end becomes a new beginning. And at last, after all the fiercest storms and sharpest bends, I have learned that life is not in the regrets of the past, nor in the plans of the future. Life is here, now, in this fleeting moment, at this table, breathing in the priceless presence of those you love, a moment as brief as a sigh, yet as eternal as the soul itself. And if someone, listening to this story, should one day find their heart broken by the betrayal of the person they trusted most, left believing that honor is lost and justice will never be done, my final whisper is this: even the darkest night must surrender to the most stubborn dawn. And though the world may strip you of everything, it can never take from you your hope, nor the dignity of the way you stand. Looking back, I now see that the cup of scalding coffee hurled at my face was not merely an act of cruelty. It was the alarm bell that woke me. The traps I laid were not only snares for another, but also trials in which I discovered my own limits and my own strength. And the greatest pain I ever endured was, in truth, the most twisted but most faithful path, leading me to life's purest happiness. The last lesson I leave you is this: choose carefully the people you allow into your life. Do not fling open the gates of your heart to everyone. But even if a tyrant enters and tears your dearest dreams to shreds, remember, within the ruins, you carry the power to rise again, stronger and wiser than before. Never forget, life is the art of deciding whether the stones thrown at you will bury you in a grave or build you a fortress. And I chose to build, from those bitter coffee grounds hurled at me, a fortress for myself and my loved ones, its walls made of respect, its mortar of love, and its roof of peace. My story ends here. A long road that began with betrayal, continued with justice, and finally found peace in the highest grace of forgiveness. And if there is only one truth I have learned, it is this: no matter how much life may throw at you, you always hold the power to turn every bitter stain into the brightest color of a new beginning, through patience, through courage, and through love. Farewell.